Are we willing to buy that MJ Melendez's new stance is going to benefit him in the 2025 season? We'll give you our thoughts next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals in the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find us on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast. We're on Odyssey and YouTube. Just be sure to hit the follow button and subscribe. And you can find me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. We'll be giving updates pretty much every single game. And even if there is some breaking news out there or just opinions we may have, that's the best place to find me. It's also the best place to reach me if you have any questions, whether it be for a Mailbag Friday or just a question in general on something that I may have talked about earlier in the week or on that day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, and with FanDuel, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started today. And a reminder that if you're a first-time listener and this is your first episode, well, I am somebody here that is based in Kansas City, work in the sports media department over at 810 WHB. But when you click on this podcast, when you're listening to Royals baseball, that's all you're going to hear, just 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. And for our first segment today, we are going to be circling back to something we dove into, roughly 3 to 4 weeks ago, really when we got word of this new stance from MJ Melendez. I had the chance to see it in person when I was down in Surprise, Arizona. And the big question amongst the fan base right now is, well, how much of it can we really trust? Melendez made an adjustment to his stance last spring training, and it clearly didn't work out. And I'm not sure that he stuck with that adjustment longer than a month or two into the regular season. I believe when things went south, he reverted back to what he was more comfortable with. Now, in seeing it in person, seeing video clips, being 10 feet away from him when he was taking BP, I can tell you that this is a drastic change. This is not a slight adjustment. This is not something that is a change in hand placement or going from an open stance to a closed stance. It's truly everything when I would talk about it in length. It's not a minor thing that goes unnoticed to the human eye. I mean, he's going to look like a completely different hitter if you haven't watched him yet on one of the TV broadcasts. And for better or worse, this is going to be the approach he takes into 2025. It's either going to work out or it's not going to work out. There's really no in between here. I'm not sold that he's just going to be puttering around at 220, 225, and he's still a bad hitter, but not as bad as last year. I believe you're going to see the same version of MJ Melendez that you did last year, or you are going to see a significantly improved hitter and a more confident hitter going into a very pivotal season for him. So let's start it off with what's different about it and how it can help him. So if I can describe this for those out there not watching on YouTube right now, I know a lot of you do watch on YouTube, so you can get the visual effect. But for those of you listening on Spotify or Apple Podcast, Melendez no longer holds the bat out in front of him. It's resting on his shoulder, and instead of the open stance, kind of has the shoulders more angled toward third base. He's now pretty much even or closed. So that's an already huge change at the plate. And that leg kick, that big Jose Bautista leg kick, is now gone. And when I talked to Mac Quatrero down in Surprise and asked him, who was the one that tried to make the adjustment with him? Was it MJ going to the coaching staff? Was it the coaching staff coming to him? And he said it was a little bit of both. But since it's MJ's career and MJ's swing, he was the one that initiated those conversations. And you do want to hear that. You don't want to have a player who was just willing to go do the same exact thing that he was doing in 2024 and going, well, I was unlucky. I need to change some things, but we'll just see how I look in spring training. No, this was a complete altering of everything he was doing at the plate. Still, the follow-through is pretty much the same, but if I was to describe The look of the stance, I would say, is just far more relaxed. There's a slight bend in the knees, but the bat rests on his shoulder, the leg kick's gone, and he's a little bit more closed. Now, here's why I believe that benefits him and why it really led me to this segment today. MJ Melendez went 2 for 3 in today's spring training win over the Rangers, which I believe, for an odd stat, they're 3-0 against Texas this year in spring training, and they've won 6 games. So half of their wins have been against the Rangers, a team they're sharing the facility with. So I'm sure there's some fun bragging rights going on there down in Surprise. But he went 2 for 3, and on his first hit of the game, which he was down 0-2 in the count, he gets a fastball up and in, like the top right corner of the zone, and he ropes it to right field for a single. And I started doing some digging out there as to how difficult that pitch was for MJ in 2024. And spoiler alert, it was almost an impossible pitch for him in 2024. So I headed over to Baseball Savant, got the breakdown of all the zones, and I'm not going to share my screen. Probably in the future when I use Baseball Savant or FanGrabs or something, I'll probably find a way here on StreamYard to screen grab something or just to share it rather easily with everybody that is watching on YouTube. But on that pitch, up and in, when you're watching MJ Melendez, he had an expected batting average on that pitch, again, high and in, but still was a strike in the zone, of .088. His batting average for that pitch, so actually the slash line he had was .063, and a slug that was just north of 200. I mean, all kinds of abysmal on that pitch. And it's no surprise why that pitch was such an issue for him. The hands were out in front of his body last year, and you had the leg kick. What was the one pitch that he found a lot of success on? When he was going well, when he had the confidence and he was heating up, it was those pitches down in the zone, whether it be down and in or down really just right below the middle of the plate. He was able to hit those pitches. Because with the load that he had, the high leg kick, the hands go back, and naturally the follow-through is going to help you on those pitches down. But when pitchers started to realize that high and in was a weak point, he couldn't get around on it because the leg kick, really threw off a lot of balance there when he wasn't going well. So you have the leg kick, the hands are out in front, so now you're bringing them closer to the body and back for the load. And then you're trying to get around on 93 to 97 high and in. And that's going to be a strike, so you got to swing. And that resulted in a lot of pop-ups for him. In fact, that was the one part of the zone that he popped up the most. 40% of those pitches, he popped up in the air. So that's telling to me. Down in the zone, only 5%, down and in, 7% down the middle, and 5% down and away. 60% of his pop-ups were pitches high and in, but just above the zone. So they weren't going to be a strike anyway, but he swung at it. His isolated power was 188 in the top right corner of the zone. His expected slug was a low in the zone at 269. His expected on base at the pitches high and inside, .088. His line drive percentage, so when we talk about MJ, how hard he hits the ball, that's one area he does not hit the ball hard. In fact, 0% was that top right corner spot on line drive percentage. He never squared anything up on that pitch, high and inside. Pitchers are going to realize that. Now, funny enough, that was not really an overwhelming spot for him when striking out. He only struck out 6 times there when pitches were located in that spot, but they knew to get him to pop up, to not really get the full extension, that's where you had to throw it. And in fact, the only time I believe he got a hit on that pitch was a home run, but he had lots of outs and lots of strikeouts when thrown in that exact location. Now, it's spring training, right? Spring training, as AJ Przinsky said today on his podcast, it means nothing. And especially down in Arizona when the ball's flying and StatCast is going to be a little bit inflated because you're playing outdoors in Arizona. The ball is going to absolutely fly. But MJ has done a good job of putting the ball in play and hitting the ball hard. David Lesky put this out there on Twitter, always a great follow for the Royals fan base. He has swung and missed only 4 times in spring training. And today he goes 2 for 3. He had an RBI triple as well. Both of the balls that he hit today that were for a base hit were above 95 miles an hour on the exit velocity. But that second one is what I took notice to, because that's a pitch that he would just not be able to get around on last year in the regular season, or for the most part in his entire career. He was a low ball hitter. And when you're asking yourself, why isn't this working? Why does he go through these long slumps? Throw him up and in. Throw the ball high in the zone, but still for a strike. His swing is not going to be able to connect with it. But now with this simplified approach, this calmer approach at the plate, which when I talked to JJ Piccolo, we was saying, we quieted it down a little bit. It's far more quiet at the plate and allows him to really tap into an explosive swing, but more importantly, be able to cover the majority of the zone. If you want MJ to turn into the hitter that we all think he can be, or at least what we saw at the minor league level, well, then covering the plate is the most important thing. It's not the power. It's not the hard hit rate. That's all fine and dandy. But to be able to cover the zone and hit to all fields, that's what can take him to the next level. And so far with this new stance, that's what I'm watching for. I'm not looking at the batting average. I'm not looking at the home runs. I'm not even looking at the exit velocities all the time. I'm looking at the location of where he's getting these hits from. If it's down the middle, like his home run and his only home run in spring training so far was a meatball that was just hung over the middle of the plate. Big deal, right? You should be able to do that as a power hitter in spring training facing 4A guys. But today, I find that more impressive because that's a pitch that gave him all kinds of trouble in 2024. Maybe with this new stance, it's not going to be as problematic for him at the plate. When we come back, I got to give more praise to Daniel Lynch because ever since being recalled on August 26th, he's done nothing but impress the Royals organization. That's coming up on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to our one and only sponsor today in FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets in the same game parlay. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. And for my pick, I'm going to go with the Mavs and Kings game coming up here at 7:30, at least Central Time if you live in this area. I am going to take the over on the rebound total for Sabonis for the Kings. I've been placing some bets on Luka Doncic, as I've told you, on some of our FanDuel picks. But for today, I am going to roll the Sacramento Kings against the Dallas Mavericks. We're going to jump over to the pitching side of things here and give a little bit of praise to Daniel Lynch, who was on the bump today through 3 clean innings. And so far in spring training, what we have to go off of, he's been impressive. Right, his whip is well below the league average that we see over the course of 162. It's around 0.8586 in that range. His ERA is sub 1.3. And yeah, big deal. As I said with MJ, you're looking at numbers of spring training, it doesn't matter. Well, for pitchers, I look for throwing strikes. I look for limiting hard contact. It's hard to do that when you're down in surprise and the ball's always flying. And at times, I just want to see the competition you're going up against, right? Daniel Lynch today did face a lot of the regulars for the Texas Rangers. And the Royals pitching staff held them to 3 runs. Noah Cameron struggled in that final inning. His velocity was down a little bit, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. But for Daniel Lynch, he was not a lock coming into spring training. He was somebody that I believed if he just showed a little bit of what he did in September, he was going to be just fine. He wasn't rolling into spring training needing to pitch his ass off to make the team. But he needed to ensure the coaching staff that, hey, I'm carrying what I did at the end of the regular season into this year. And he's done exactly that. And that's impressive to see because Daniel Lynch was one of those guys last year in spring training I barely paid attention to. With the state of the Royals rotation, who they had brought in, who was competing for the number 5 spot, I wasn't even looking in the direction of any Daniel Lynch start out there or any time he was out there on the mound. It's not that I had given up, but there were other guys I was more interested in watching than Daniel Lynch in spring training. You had Cole Reagans out there. You had Lugo. You had Waka. And then you had Brady Singer as well competing for the number 4 spot. And that 5th spot was between Alec Marsh and Jordan Lyles. I knew back then that even with a strong spring, Daniel Lynch was not going to make the roster. And he didn't. And even though he made it up to Kansas City midway through the season and bounced around a little bit between Omaha and Kansas City, he never stuck. He was never a mainstay. And when he got called up, he made a spot start against the Rangers that went pretty well. He had some decent long relief outings. Then he had the blow up against Seattle, one of the best games all year, where the Royals erased a 7-run deficit. All those 7 runs came in the first inning off Daniel Lynch. And he still stuck around for a little bit. In fact, the last time that we saw the bad version of Daniel Lynch was a game I was in attendance for. It was June 12th against the Yankees when the Royals were struggling a little bit and the Yankees were red hot. They had an absurd run differential. And the Royals opened with Dan Altavilla because they were trying to make up starts with Michael Wacha on the IL with the fractured foot. And Daniel Lynch was going to piggyback. Well, lo and behold, Dan Altavilla gets roughed up in the first inning, and they got to go to Dan Lynch pretty early on. And Daniel Lynch comes out of the bullpen. He gets hit hard, but he's getting some good fortune. He's getting some good luck by good defense. Sometimes the ball was scalded, and it found the glove of somebody on the infield. But he gets through 6 2/3. And the exit that he had was more of a sour note because he had just given up a 3-run bomb to Giancarlo Stanton, and he was a strike away from getting out of the inning. And in the locker room after the game, when we spoke with Daniel Lynch, he's saying, I feel like I don't need an opener. I can start games at this level. And it's not that I walked away saying, he's throwing Matt Quatraro under the bus, but it just had the feel of he's not going to be around much longer. And he gets demoted the very next day. And I'll be completely honest with everybody. I thought that was the last we were going to see of Daniel Lynch. Barring some crazy injury that happened in the rotation and him needing to come back up because he was one of the more capable starters in Omaha, I did not envision him getting back to Kansas City. I thought it would lead to an eventual DFA, clear up some spots on the 40-man, and you cut your losses and you move on. If he catches on elsewhere, he catches on elsewhere. But credit to him for coming back up to Kansas City and in the middle of a playoff push, pitching as well as he ever had in his entire career. And a big part of it was his ability to throw strikes. It wasn't the velocity. He was tinkering with some new pitches, abandoning the four-seam a little bit. And I don't want to say abandoning, lessening the workload on the four-seam fastball, throwing that sinker, now throwing a little bit of a cutter, utilizing that changeup effectively. And we saw a different version of him. And you can let me know in the comments, but in September when Daniel Lynch climbed the bump out of the bullpen in long relief, whether it was a close game or not, I expected him to give me 2 scoreless innings or 3 scoreless innings if he had to go pretty deep into the game. But it was quick. It was efficient. He attacked the zone. He was aggressive. And we hadn't seen that from Daniel Lynch in his entire career. Now, he doesn't pitch in the postseason. That was a big talking point amongst Royals fans. Why Michael Lorenzen in a 1-inning role instead of Daniel Lynch? Well, maybe you're playing matchups at that point. But nonetheless, we've closed the book on the 2024 season. Now going into 2025, I'm sure Daniel Lynch is still telling himself, I'm competing for a rotation spot. My gut tells me it's going to be Chris Bubich from how much they value him. Not that they don't value Daniel Lynch, but you don't move Chris Bubich from a spot that he was so effective in and try him out as a starter only to say, nah, it's not for us. We're going to move him back to the bullpen. I believe that Chris Bubich had a margin for error because they were stretching him out in the offseason. Daniel Lynch has found this role in Kansas City as a long relief guy or somebody when the bullpen's taxed, he can give him multiple innings in a 1-run game. And if you can throw strikes and you can get quick outs, you are going to do wonders for a team, especially with the power they have in the back end of the bullpen. I mean, if you are in a 4-game series, you're not going to be able to go Harvey, Estevez, Ursig for all 4 games. There's going to be that one game, depending how the starters look, where you got to piece together the final 9 outs of that game. And to have somebody who can give you the 7th and the 8th in a tight game, that can stretch out your bullpen a little bit. Because there are some guys that are just 1-inning guys. Like, to me, John Schreiber's a 1-inning guy. You might see him get stretched out for 2 innings if he threw 6 pitches in the 7th. You might see them go back to him. Angel Serpa's a 2-inning guy. Hunter Harvey's a 1-inning guy. To me, Ursig and Estevez should be 1-inning guys just so they're not overworked. Hey, you get late in the postseason or you have a must-have game, then yeah, let's air it out a little bit. But to have Daniel Lynch, and I remember it in the Washington series in September, they utilized him perfectly in one of those games. Like, it was 3 innings. He's throwing 75 to 80% strikes. He's putting his sinker in a good spot. The changeup is getting whiffs. The slider looks good. The knuckle curve. By the way, today he threw 6 pitches. That's nice to have in the role that he has. And it's not 6 pitches where 3 of them aren't really buttoned up, where they're kind of just 3 throwaway pitches. Now, these are about 4 to 5 pitches that are pretty damn good, and the cutter is just now coming into his arsenal. Well, the stuff looks good for him, and credit to him. Credit to him, credit to the Royals as well for not giving up on him when it looked like this was probably it. I mean, as I said, for that Yankees start that he had, or the Yankees outing when he went 6 2/3 and gave up 6 runs, his ERA was over 6.3 after that game and then gets demoted. If you thought back then, that September Daniel Lynch was going to happen, you would have been crazy. You would have been called crazy for sure. And now Daniel Lynch looks like a mainstay in that bullpen. And all of a sudden, that 2018 draft class with all the pitchers, what you got out of Brady Singer, what you're getting out of Chris Bubich, and maybe what you get out of Daniel Lynch, it's starting to look like a pretty good draft class where you're getting value out of all of those arms, and you are seeing what those scouts saw about 6-7 years ago. Okay, we're going to take our final break of the show. When we come back, some fun news to end on. Mike Moustakas is going to sign a 1-day contract with the Royals on May 31st, and he is going to retire with the club. We'll give you our thoughts next on Locked On Royals. You are tuning to Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. For our final segment, we want to end on a little bit of good news, which is that one of the core members of those World Series winning, 2-time American League champion team, 1-time AL Central Division champion team, Mike Moustakas, one of those core members, is going to be the next Royal of that group to retire. The team announced that they will sign him to a 1-day contract on May 31st, and he will retire, and they'll be able to celebrate him properly on that game. I believe J.J. Piccolo also told the guys over at Cody and Gold on 96.5, and Josh Vernier as well was in that. So J.J. Piccolo announced that, then the Royals officially announced it. But all around, a great gesture, a great thing to do, because they also did it for Lorenzo Cain. And for some of you out there, aren't you feeling a bit old now? I mean, Lorenzo Cain, retired from baseball. Eric Hosmer, retired from baseball. Now Mike Moustakas, retired from baseball. Escobar's no longer in the league. Nori Aoki's no longer in the league. Infante's not. Kendrys Morales isn't. Alex Rios, of course, isn't. James Shields isn't. And you look back, and it's been 10 years. And some of those guys were no spring chickens back then. And Mike Moustakas, as you can tell if you're watching on YouTube, the catch that he had, and that was Game 3 of the ALCS against Baltimore in 2014, going over the dugout suites and the fans lifting him up. I always thought it was such a cool moment because he had said after the game, it was symbolic almost, because the fans that had always been there for him, lifting him up, they were there to catch him when he leaned over the railing and made the catch. And to me, it's one of the most iconic photos in Royals history. Just because of how absurdly difficult that catch was. But then you have the fans in the dugout suite that are holding him up, and they're pointing to his glove, and they're holding up the out symbol. and the umpire comes over and you just see a ball reach out of that dugout suite. And it gives you chills. It absolutely does. And Moose had multiple moments in 2014 and 15, but he was that one guy that was so easy to root for because of the struggles he had gone through. He was demoted in 2014, and the Royals had Danny Valencia up that was going to be taking over third base responsibilities, though Valencia was so much of a platoon hitter, you only needed him to do it for a little bit. But Danny Valencia gets hurt. Moose has to turn the car back around, and when he gets back to Kansas City, he takes off on this tear and becomes one of the stars of their playoff run. Now, he wasn't the star. Lorenzo Cain was the best player, I'll always say, on the 14 and 15 team, excluding the bullpen guys like Wade Davis and Greg Holland. But, Eric Hosmer was the face, and Salvador Perez was the face. And even guys like Alcides Escobar got more screen time and more airtime than Mike Moustakas did. But Moose had come up with Hosmer, and they were close teammates. And in 2015, he becomes the vocal leader, maybe not becomes, but has one moment in Houston when they're down in that fateful Game 4 moment. They're down 4 runs in the 8th inning, and Moose is the one to get them fired up, saying, we're not going home. We're not done. And they have that improbable rally. And Moustakas is the one that's getting everybody juiced up. And what's great is he doesn't even get on base in that 8th inning rally. Everybody else is. But yet there he is on the top step of the dugout, clapping, yelling. It shows the teammate that he was. And he was a fiery guy. He was a passionate guy. And he was one of those top prospects coming up and one of those high draft picks that you looked at him and said, he's going to be one of our cornerstone pieces who you build this franchise around. And he didn't live up to maybe the astronomical expectations that are given to top 10 picks in the Major League Baseball draft. But you ask any Royals fan out there if Mike Moustakas was worth all of it, right? The pick and bringing him back in 2018 after the World Series, what his injury back in 2016 meant to the entire team. I mean, I believe the 2016 team didn't make the postseason because of that day in Chicago when Gordon and Moustakas collided and Moose tore his ACL and he was out for the year. Like, it showed how much of an impact that was. And even though Chesler Cuthbert comes up and puts together some nice contributions for a little bit, it wasn't Moustakas. And to me, Mike Moustakas is my favorite Royal of all time. I feel like I have said it before on this podcast, but on those teams, he was my favorite because he dealt with the adversity. He was a guy that was struggling. He knew there was pressure on him to perform. And then he goes out there in the postseason, has that Game 1 ALDS home run in Anaheim. He had debuted there, right? And he's from California. And so he has his major league debut in Anaheim. And then the postseason years later, he gets that opportunity in extra innings. He also catches the final out in that game. In 2015, he's got the home run in Game 6 against Toronto. It's just all of those things combined. The catch and like I said, behind me, that frame picture, that catch in Game 3 of the ALCS, they're iconic. And his name, Moustakas, Mike Moustakas, it's a name you're going to remember for years and years and years. People my age, people even younger than me, those that watch Mike Moustakas, you talk about that team 20, 30 years down the road, people are going to go, oh, I know who you're talking about, right? Even though I was not alive or around for those 1980s teams. There's a lot of guys on that team I know simply because of how much they're referenced, and Moustakas is one of those guys that's been referenced so much. And even when he came back in 2018, I thought that was really cool to end his Royals career with. That, he still gets that one last opportunity to play with Alcides Escobar, play in front of Kansas City, and then he gets traded at the deadline for Brett Phillips and Jorge Lopez. Lopez then later on almost throws a perfect game. One I was in attendance for in Minnesota. Just the odds on that is crazy, but I was at Target Field when Jorge Lopez almost threw the perfect game. But Moustakas goes to Milwaukee, and he gets another opportunity to go and compete in the postseason. And Brewers fans love Mike Moustakas, what he was able to do in that run where they lost in Game 7 of the NLCS. But he plays with, his old buddy and Lorenzo Cain. Manny Piña's on that team. Jeremy Jeffress is on that team, minor league teammates and stuff like that. And he gets to live through October baseball again. And Brewers fans, I would imagine, are a lot like Royals fans, where you have the small market feel. You embrace that team. It's wild. It's chaotic. It's crazy. And Moose got to experience that. And it didn't work out in Cincinnati, but doesn't always work out that way. But he had, in my opinion, a storied career, one that'll be talked about for years and years and years. Not so much the overall production, but what he meant to those teams. He was a phenomenal player, a phenomenal teammate for those squads, and one of the leaders. And I watched the Digging Deep podcast with Hosmer and Moustakas. They do a great job. The stories they tell are great. And can't wait to see what the Royals have in store on May 31st, because I think that's a great deal to have him sign that one-day contract and then retire a Royal. If you've got a favorite Mike Moustakas memory, let us know in the YouTube comments below, or let us know on Twitter as well. Again, at JohnnyJ_15. That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. Thank you for making Locked On Royals your first listen today. For your second, check out the Locked On Fantasy Baseball Podcast with host Dominic Martino and Matthew Onay. MLB Fantasy Draft season is here. Be the most informed fan and set yourself up for a league win. Find Locked On Podcast on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Tomorrow, we'll have a little bit more of a deep dive into the roster, some of the guys that got sent to minor league camp, and maybe a couple of those final roster spots for the Royals. I'll tell you this, I'm starting to change my mind on a few. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.